Starting off this very unfair list at number 10 with Santiago Ventura. In 1986, he was convicted of murdering a 19-year-old man after they had an argument. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison but maintained his innocence despite being offered a plea deal. He made several appeals after his conviction, but they were all denied. However, due to a lack of an appropriate interpreter and other deficiencies in the trial, it actually led to his conviction being overturned, and it was determined that a different person was responsible for the murder. He spent about 5 years in prison as an innocent man, but he had plans to become a lawyer someday so that he can help people in a very similar situation. And like I said, we all know there's many people in this situation. Number 9.
We have breaking team coverage this evening. One of the brothers accused of murdering his 5 family members in Broken Arrow will spend the rest of his life in prison.
This right here is 16-year-old Michael Bever, who with his older brother Robert Bever killed their parents and 3 siblings during a murder spree. Is this real life right now? This is just so messed up. So now, living a life without his parents, he will see the inside of a prison cell for the rest of his life. Bever's 2 younger sisters, one being just 5 years old, was attacked in what was described as the worst single criminal event in the history of Broken Arrow City in Oklahoma. I mean, that is just so messed up. Bever was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder for his role in the killings. His lawyer did try to defend Michael Bever, saying that it was his older brother that planned and led the murder. His older brother actually, he took a plea deal to his crimes and he was sentenced to life without parole. By pleading guilty, Michael's older brother Robert avoided the death penalty. Michael Bever was also sentenced. His lawyers couldn't get him off the hook to this traumatizing event. Number 8.
Now at the heart of all of today's proceedings was the issue of parole. Judge Edward Lukemeyer, who's presiding over the case, said at the outset that the issue is determining whether White fits in what he called the narrow subset of juveniles who deserve a life sentence without parole.
Well, for teenager Dakota White, he fit the narrow subset of juveniles who deserves a life sentence without parole, according to a judge. It seemed like Dakota didn't feel remorse for what he has done during a few recording phone calls of him bragging about his murder that he committed. There didn't seem like a chance of rehabilitating this teenager, so that's when he was given the harsh sentence. During the trial, it only took jurors about 15 minutes to come up with the deliberation of guilty. He was found guilty of stabbing and strangling Sam Poss to death. He was just 17 years old at the time of the murder. Number 7. We have 17 years old at the time of his crime, Joseph Spencer. He pleaded guilty to 3 first-degree murder charges in the deaths of his parents, and this is during Labor Day weekend. Joseph went on a killing spree. He was given 2 life sentences after he was tried as an adult. He will have to serve 2 life sentences concurrently, so one after another. And then when that's done, he has to serve his 3rd sentence. Spencer's dad was a UPS pilot, his mom was a science teacher, and I'm pretty sure this kid deserves to never see the light of day. Moving into number 6, we have 14-year-old Koalten Glenn Orr. And he was 14 at the time of his crime. He pleaded guilty for shooting and killing his father's fiancée, Laura Hendricks, and this took place in their home. He was sentenced to life in prison. Right after the murder took place, the teenager just walked into a police station and he confessed to everything he has done. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that Orr should be tried as an adult, so he was given life in prison. Right now there are appeals to try to have this teen tried as a juvenile, but that's most likely going to be denied. Orr's lawyers are trying to argue that sexual abuse that was done to him was the reason that drove him to commit these awful crimes, but that was quickly discredited. At least now he's going to have a very long time to think about what he has done. Number 5.
Robert, we do begin with breaking news for our viewers in the West. We want to show you these pictures. Aerial shot of a middle school in Noblesville, Indiana. What has become a familiar scene. Students appear to be evacuating, running from their own school after reports that there has been a shooter there at Noblesville West Middle School.
Hearing about school shootings, it really upsets me, and I'm sure it upsets a lot of you guys. It seems way too common. Teens seem to be able to get their hands on guns like way too easily. There has to be some sort of gun control laws that makes it harder for citizens of America to get guns, or just even ban them altogether. I know it's a huge debate. There hasn't been a mass shooting in Australia who has banned guns like 20 years ago, but I know it would be close to impossible to ban all guns in America. Going back to this story, we have a 13-year-old in which his identity, we actually don't know it. He is a minor, so his identity is protected under the law, in which I think is kind of stupid when you think about it. This teen was capable of committing murder. Why then we're trying to protect him? Well, he will remain in the state's juvenile detention system until he's 18 years old, and then he's going to be transferred to an adult prison where he's going to serve out the rest of his sentence. Because he showed no remorse for what he has done, it's likely the teen will never leave prison. Moving into number 4, we have Taylor Lane Gwaltney, who was just 19 years old when he committed the murder and then he bragged about it. The murder took place in Colorado Springs, where the teen attacked a homeless man with a baseball bat. The homeless man was 55-year-old Doyle, who was beaten to death. Doyle was discovered earlier that morning, partially wrapped in a sleeping bag. He had been hit on the head at least 4 to 7 times. During the trial, a 7-man, 5-woman jury took just 2 hours to convict him. The hearing trial did take 3 weeks, so the jury had to listen in onto some pretty horrifying details about the crime. Well, the teen was convicted of the murder and he was sentenced to life in prison, and he showed absolutely no remorse for what he has done. He bragged to 16 people about the murder. Well, at least he is now living in the right place for the rest of his life. Next up, number 3, we have 7-year-old Gavon Ramsay, who was just found guilty of 4 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of murder, 1 count of aggravated burglary, 1 count of kidnapping, and 1 count of gross abuse of a corpse. Is this real life right now? What does that even mean, gross abuse of a corpse? Let's not think about it. Well, Ramsay killed 98-year-old Margaret Douglas, which is just so sickening. I mean, poor woman who lived so long only to be murdered. This kid is just sick.
A sentence tonight for the Medina County teenager who broke into the home of a 98-year-old woman, videotaped her sleeping before killing her and abusing her body.
Ramsay was given life in prison.
He left in chains, where he'll remain for life without parole, for the teenager who robbed a 98-year-old from reaching her dream of 100.
Moving into number 2.
The court, having duly considered your offenses, it is hereby ordered that you be committed to the Department of Youth Services until the age of 21, and furthermore committed to the Massachusetts Correctional Institution at Cedar Junction for the period of not less than 25 years.
So that was Philip Chism at the age of 14 years old. He was found guilty on many charges. He raped and killed his 24-year-old math teacher. Chism was ordered to serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. He started his sentence at a juvenile facility. Once he turns 21 years old, he's then going to be transferred to a maximum adult prison where he will serve out the rest of his sentence. Chism was found guilty on many charges. He was sentenced to 25 years for premeditated murder. Once that sentence is complete, he will then have to serve another sentence of 40 years for armed robbery. Once that sentence is complete, so that's about 65 years at this point, he's going to have another 40-year sentence for armed robbery. After he's done that, he's going to have another 40-year sentence. And it's not done yet. After that sentence, if this teen is still alive at the age of 79 years old, he's going to have to serve his last sentence of rape. So that is another 40 years. This teen will have to become the world's oldest person to be able to be released from prison at the age of 119 years old. Finally, number 1, we have 10-year-old Antonio Barbeau, who was charged with killing his great-grandmother in her Wisconsin home. He also had a friend help with the murder. Barbeau and his friend decided to try to steal money from 78-year-old Barbara Olson, but things took a turn, and a robbery, it turned into a murder scene. They took turns beating her with a hatchet and hammer.
Sentencing was held today for a teenager convicted in a crime that rattled Sheboygan County and fiercely divided a family. Antonio Barbeau learned he'll be a middle-aged man before he gets a chance at parole for killing his great-grandmother.
There doesn't seem to be much remorse, so I'm not sure if this kid will ever get out of prison. After Barbeau and his friend committed the murder, they actually decided to go out and enjoy some pizza. These are not behaviors of remorse. Barbeau's attorney was shocked when Barbeau was given a life sentence. He believes that kids, especially at the age of just 10 years old, shouldn't be given a life sentence. But you know what? If you're capable of doing the crime, then I think you should be old enough, and capable enough to do the time.
Our statutes, the way they're standing right now, 10-year-old facing life in prison, I don't understand that. They aren't adults, they're children.
Coming in at number 10, we have QUINN SKAGGS. Right off the bat, with a name like QUINN SKAGGS, you know this guy means business. This guy sounds like he's a character from a Guy Ritchie movie. If you're in the crime world and you're dealing with QUINN SKAGGS, he's probably going to cut your pinky off when you don't pay him back in time. Now, Quinn had a long rap sheet when he was brought in. He was only 17 and he had already been arrested for a burglary spree where he was breaking into people's homes while armed with a handgun. Man, at his age, the most dangerous thing I was doing was trying to convince my older brother to buy me a Mickey of rum so I could feel cool at a party. Skaggs also got into a fight at school, and when a teacher tried to break it up, he beat the hell out of the teacher, who needed to have surgery on his face. This 17-year-old was being held in a detention center and then kicked out the window and used bed sheets to scale down the side of the building like he was in the show Prison Break.
Coming in at number 9 is ATIF, RAFAY and Sebastian Burns. Funnily enough, I knew about this case beforehand because it's a very good Netflix docu-series about different crimes, and it's called The Confession Tapes, and this was that first case it actually explored. Highly recommend. But anyway, in Bellevue back in 1994, ATIF and his best friend Sebastian came back to ATIF's family's house for the holidays. All was well until the boys came back from a long night out to discover ATIF's parents and sister brutally murdered and his house a complete mess. After their murder, ATIF inherited basically everything his parents had, buying a new car, living a new lifestyle, and seemingly not mourning the loss of his family at all. Police in both the US and Canada suspected the two boys of killing his family in order to get their money. They slandered them in the news like there was no tomorrow, branded them as murderers, and then using the Mr. Big technique to extract a confession from them. This technique is actually illegal in the US, but legal in Canada where it was done. It involves undercover cops gaining the suspect's trust by involving them in illegal activities and then getting them to confess. Even with multiple alibis and no physical evidence, the undercover cop kept probing Burns to confess and he would make it all go away. I'm assuming in the hopes of making his life go back to normal, Burns did confess, and later on so did ATIF, even though their stories were completely different. Both were found guilty in 2004 of a triple murder and were both sentenced to 3 life sentences each, even though they've been in prison for the past 20 years. At first I thought, how could anyone murder their parents, but after doing this video and seeing how many people actually did, I was like, wow, this is a thing. This actually happens. At number 8 is Joshua Smith. Now in February of 2012, 14-year-old Joshua broke into his stepfather Chico's room and stole his shotgun. Right after that, he started shooting things around the house, and Chico and his daughter were able to escape his rampage by breaking a window and climbing through. Joshua's mother, Tamiko Robertson, was sleeping on the sofa when he shot her around 12 to 14 times at close range. And why did he do this, you may be wondering? Because his mother was being a mother. That's right, Joshua started hanging out with the wrong crowd and wanted to join a gang, do drugs, pop pills. He started coming home at ridiculous hours, so Tamiko gave him a curfew and told him to stop hanging out with these people, and that's what triggered him. He pled guilty to second-degree murder and will be in jail for anywhere from 30 to 50 years. Filling our number 7 slot now is Evan Miller. Now Evan's life was hard enough. By the time he turned 14 in 2003, he'd been in and out of foster care due to his stepfather continuously beating him and his mother abusing drugs and alcohol. One day he was hanging out with his friends and his neighbor Cannon, who also happened to be one of his mum's drug dealers. After spending most of the night drinking and smoking weed, Evan and his friends attempted to rob Cannon after beating him. Evan beat him with a baseball bat and then set his trailer on fire, and he later died from his injuries and smoke inhalation. When brought to trial, his friend was offered life with a chance of parole if he testified against Evan, which obviously he did. In 2006, Evan was sentenced to life without parole, and now at 28 years old, he may have a chance at a retrial, but for now he's still very much in prison. Now at number 6 is Jacob P. Ind. Back in 1992, when Jacob was 15 years old, he killed his mum and his stepdad. After enduring years of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse, Jacob hired another older teen to help him murder his parents. Then, in the morning of December 17th, they went to their bedroom where they were fast asleep and attacked them for 5 whole minutes using various gruesome methods, stabbing them, spraying their faces with bear mace, and shooting them as well. He never testified during his first trial since his defense told him he would pack up and leave if he tried, so he was sentenced sentenced to life without parole. After spending 25 years in prison, he was finally granted a retrial and the right to testify back in August of 2018. And his retrial hasn't happened yet, so we don't know the conviction as of yet. Coming at number 5 is Diana ORTIZ. Diana was 18 years old when she moved to New York in 1983 to flee an abusive relationship, and that's where she eventually met her new boyfriend who was double her age. The man introduced her to drugs like heroin, LSD, and cocaine and convinced that the only way to sustain both their habits was to stage a robbery. Note, not a murder, just a robbery. The plan was sorted. She would pose as a prostitute in a parking lot, wait for someone to approach her, and then her boyfriend and some friends would rob him. However, on the actual day, the victim that pulled up to her started fighting with the men and a brawl ensued and he was eventually shot. While they all ran off in separate directions, what they had no clue about was that the customer was actually an off-duty police officer and he actually died a few days later. Diana turned herself in and was convicted of felony murder and was sentenced to 17 years to life. And after 22.5 years in prison, she finally went on parole. Imagine 22.5 years in prison. I'm only 21 right now and I feel like I lived a long life. That's my life and then some, all in prison. I can't even imagine that. At number 4 is QUANTEL Lotz. Now Lotz, like a lot of other kids on this list, had a troubled upbringing. His dad, mum, stepmom, uncles, aunts, basically everyone around him was addicted to cocaine, even getting high on it while he was still in the room at a very young age. He'd seen his uncle get shot multiple times because of drugs and he himself was beaten on a regular basis. By 14 he used to have bouts of getting very angry, then crying uncontrollably, and then amnesia about what happened. In 1999 he was play fighting with his stepbrother Michael. It started off innocently as it always does. Michael sent a blow dart his way, Lotz fired back with a toy bow and arrow, but then it turned very ugly and escalated into a proper fight. It ended with Lotz stabbing Michael a few times and then ultimately killing him. He literally doesn't remember the incident whatsoever, he just remembers being told the next day that his brother was dead and he was the reason. He was tried as an adult, not a juvenile, and was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Even though at 14 the state of Missouri thinks you're too young to legally get married, leave school, donate blood, get a tattoo without parental approval, yet you're old enough to be tried as an adult and then put away in jail forever. Filling in on number 3 slot is John KATEHIS. Back in 2009, John was 16 at the time when he put up an ad on Craigslist offering sexual services in exchange for money, and the very popular ABC reporter George Weber replied to his ad. When they finally met up for this kinky hookup, if we can call it that, John claimed that George pulled a knife on him and as self-defense he stabbed George 50 times. Mind you, George was bound and being choked when this happens, so I don't know how he could have even pulled a knife out to begin with. And if it was really self-defense, why 50 times? Surely someone's dead after maybe a few, or at least injured enough for you to escape the situation. During his hearings and his confession tapes, you can see him literally wink and smile throughout. At 18 years old, John was found guilty and was sentenced to 25 years to life, and at 28 years old, he's still in prison today. Now at number 2 is Ashley Jones. Ashley was a problem child raised by problematic parents. Her stepdad used to sexually molest her and her mum was a drug addict, so it appeared to be a blessing when her grandparents agreed to take in her and her sister. I don't know if they agreed to take her in or her parents kicked her out since she stabbed both her dad and her pregnant mum a year beforehand. Luckily neither died. A year later, at 14 years old, she was disobeying her grandparents more and more and she was dating a boy they didn't approve of. The couple hatched a plan and she helped her boyfriend commit a series of murders. First they killed her granddad, shooting him twice in the face and then stabbing him to death, then her aunt who they shot in her sleep and then set them both on fire. They also attacked her grandmom who also got burned on the face, stabbed in the chest and jaw and shot in the shoulder. Luckily she survived and she also tried to kill her own 10-year-old sister by stabbing her 14 times, but she also survived, thank God. Now at 24 years old she's still in prison serving out her life sentence. And finally at number 1 is ERIN CAFFEY. Way back in March of 2008, ERIN started dating a boy called Charlie Wilkinson. Story seems pretty pretty kosher so far. After meeting Charlie, her parents felt like there was something off about him but didn't worry too much, but then Erin started to change. Her interests changed, her demeanor changed, and her parents thought Charlie was a bad influence and wanted them to break up. So what do any desperate teenagers do in that situation? Hatch a plan. Charlie and his friend Wade went into Erin's house while she waited in the car with Wade's girlfriend and shot Erin's mother Penny whilst also nearly decapitating her with a katana. They then shot her youngest brother Matthew in the head, while James and his friend both took turns stabbing her other brother Tyler. As if that wasn't bad enough, they then set the house on fire and it was completely ruined. Erin's father was also really badly injured. They shot him nearly 11 times whilst they killed Penny, but luckily he survived and was able to escape the house before it completely went up in flames. I mean, I don't know how lucky that is considering he survived his wife and kids and his remaining child is in jail, but it's still a good sign. Initially no one suspected Erin, but during Charlie and Wade's questionings they both said that the murders were Erin's idea. At 17 years old, Erin pleaded guilty to murder, as did Charlie, and they were both given 2 consecutive life sentences plus 25 years.
Starting off this countdown, we have TJ Lane. Back in February of 2012, 18-year-old TJ Lane entered a high school in Ohio and shot 3 students. He injured 3 others. There was no motive for his actions, and during his trial, he showed no remorse. In fact, during his sentencing, he was absolutely ruthless. He entered the court wearing a light blue button-up shirt, which he removed to reveal a white t-shirt with the word "killer" written on the front of it. If that's not bad enough, at one point he turned to the courtroom, said some obscene things, and then gave them a middle finger. You can see that he just doesn't care. It's scary how he shows like zero emotion, and he killed people.
Alright, moving on this list, at number 9 we have 2 best friends, Ricky Jackson and Willie Bridgman. And they were arrested at the age of 16 years old for a murder that took place in Cleveland, Ohio. Harold Franks was the victim. Well, he was attacked with acid and he was shot twice with a .38 caliber gun. Both teenagers received the death penalty back in 1977, but it was later turned over to life imprisoned.
Yes. It was young Vernon's testimony that put Jackson on death row.
I could halfway accept my punishment if I was guilty, but excuse me.
This story takes a huge turn because after spending 40 years behind bars, a judge released them, and the judge said they actually have the wrong people. Ricky and Willie were convicted after a false testimony that was given by a 12-year-old boy. These 2 friends didn't commit the crime, so for the past 40 years they were serving time for someone else's crime. Their lives has been taken away from them.
Words can't express how I feel right now. I'm just glad to be out, glad to be a free man.
What are you going to do today? Where are you going to go?
Wow. I mean, you know, you sit in prison for so long, you think about this day, but when it actually comes, you don't know what you just want to do something, you know?
This guy missed out on school, getting his first job, finding a wife, having kids. Being a teenager, you get to experience a lot of things in life, and it is a very important and crucial time in someone's life. Number 8, we have Howard Christensen. He is a Chicago native who became the nation's longest serving prisoner before he finally completed his time. At the age of 17 years old, Howard committed murder and was given a life sentence without parole to 200 years in prison. But that was later overturned to a 64-year prison sentence, which is pretty much life in prison. While Howard actually outlived his prison sentence and was able to see the light of day. Well, just for a few years. Howard was 79 years old when he was finally released. Howard was only able to live 2 years as a free man before he passed away. Moving right along here, we have Bobby Bostic, and he comes onto our list at number 7. Bobby was just 16 years old when he was convicted of committing 17 crimes. Some of them include robbery and kidnapping. He fired a gun at 2 people. While he has been in prison for more than 20 years now, he is now in his 40s. Bobby on our list has one of the longest prison sentences. He was actually sentenced to 241 years. Many people believe that this was way too harsh for this crime. Murder was not committed, although there was near death. Back in 2010, 2010, the Supreme Court decided that their initial decision was unconstitutional and minors should have the opportunity to demonstrate maturity and rehabilitation. Even with that though, Bobby won't be eligible for parole until he's 112 years old. So if somehow he's able to outlive that, he has a chance of being a free man one day. Let's talk about a case I've paid close attention to. I've been very fascinated with it. Well, at number 6, let's talk about Brendan Dassey. Probably sounds familiar to you guys. I talk about him a whole lot. Well, he's a nephew of Steven Avery, the guy from Making a Murder documentary. It's on Netflix.
How you doing, buddy?
Good. Then they sat down with Brendan. Brendan's lawyers say investigators took advantage of him. Then just 16 years old and with a low IQ, manipulating him into making a false confession.
Brendan Dassey was just 16 years old when he was convicted of first-degree murder and second-degree sexual assault mutilation of a corpse. I believe Brendan Dassey is innocent and was framed. He was sentenced to life in prison with the earliest possibility of parole in 2048. So that's when Brendan Dassey turns 58 years old. Right now he's 28 years old. Steven Avery, his uncle, is also still in prison and he has served 18 years for a crime he never committed. He was released, but then he was sentenced again for a new crime, and I don't believe he committed that either. I think he was framed by the same people who convicted him wrongly the first time. So in total, Steven Avery has been in prison for 30 years, and you know what, I can't wait for season 2 of Making a Murderer to be released on Netflix because I need answers. And actually at number 5, let's talk about Steven Avery a little bit more. He was also a teenager when he was first in prison. Steven was 18 years old when he was convicted of sexual assault and attempted murder, and this was back in 1985. Like I said, after 18 years and after DNA testing became more available, it was proven that Steven Avery was actually the wrong guy and evidence was tampered with by local police. He was serving a 30-year sentence.
Back home, relatives waited patiently. After 18 years, the last few hours were the longest, until finally, the reunion.
Too long, though, too long. Oh, God, I love you, baby.
Steven Avery was only free for a few years until he was convicted for a murder. This was back in 2007, and he was given a life imprisonment sentence.
They keep on trying to do something with me. They're trying to find ends. They don't believe none of us. You know, whatever we say, they just don't. We're all liars.
And next up, number 4, we have 65-year-old Wilbert Jones, who was just 19 years old when he was sentenced to prison. He served 46 years for a crime that he didn't even commit. His conviction was just recently overturned. Back in 1971, Jones was found guilty of kidnapping and sexually assaulting a nurse in Louisiana. Apparently, authorities withheld evidence that could have exonerated Jones decades ago. I think this man should have been rewarded millions of dollars, although money won't give his life back. The state of Louisiana took away this man's life. I would be super upset in this situation, but for some reason Jones, he's just thankful for being free.
No, I forgave. You know what I'm saying? I forgive. Because the Lord God knows who's in my life. I don't have no bit in my life. I got to go the rest of my life.
Number 3, we have James Robertson, who actually inspired a new documentary on Netflix called I Am a Killer. I'm currently watching it and it's really good. I don't know why I'm so interested in these topics, but they just fascinate me. And I swear, if I wasn't a YouTuber, I'd want to get into criminal psychology or work for Netflix and create these documentaries. James Robertson has had a whole life of crime. He was just 16 years old when he was sent to prison, but his crime started at a much younger age. He grew up with a family that are alcoholics and abusive. Robert is currently in prison for a crime he committed back in 1980, and it was for theft. He has been in prison for the past 37 years. For 20 of those years, James Robertson was left in solitary confinement because he was hard to deal with. So for 23 hours in the day, he's stuck in a very tiny dark room. He doesn't get much visitations. Actually, I don't think he's allowed them at all. Barely no sunlight. And when he does get out of his cell for 1 hour a day, he's in another small cage outside. So James couldn't take this anymore, so he decided to kill his new cellmate, who was a pedophile, because he wanted to be placed on death row. I mean, is this real life right now? While on death row, the rules are different. You actually get a bed to sleep on, you actually get more food to eat, you get medical care. Also, James didn't want to be in prison while he was older because he said, well, he's just going to become an easy target for people to beat up up. So he just wants to leave the world. So crazy because he was just trying to fight for the death penalty, but it took him a long time to actually get it, which is this is a very unusual request. Number 2, we have Joseph Ligon, who was just 15 years old when he was convicted of murdering 2 people back in 1953. Well, it's been 63 years since he was first sentenced to prison. Currently, Joseph is about 80 years old, and he has spent most of his life in a Philadelphia prison. He actually made it into the news a few years ago because he was given the chance of parole, but he turned it down. Joseph rejected this deal out of principle. He claims that he didn't kill anyone. It's really sad, and you know what? There are thousands of innocent people who are in prison serving time for crimes they didn't commit, and Joseph is probably one of them. Why would he choose to continue to fight for his innocence even when he could be released from prison? So now he is the longest serving juvenile lifer in the world that has been documented. And finally, we have made it to number 1. We have Paul Giedel Jr. And he is known to have served the longest prison sentence in the United States. Back in 1911, Paul was convicted of second-degree murder at the age of 17 years old. When Paul was released from prison, he was 86 years old, meaning he was in prison for 68 years. He was locked away in many different New York State prisons. Paul lived to see the day when he was actually released from prison. When Paul was paroled from prison, he didn't want to leave because that was the only life that he knew. He would probably go into shell shock because the world, it just changes so fast. He was in prison from 1911 to 1979. So let me tell you guys quickly what was invented during that time. So just to name a few, we had radio broadcasting, helicopters, microwaves, ovens, credit cards, widescreen cinemas, videotape recorders, video games, man went to space, computers were a new thing, and I mean all of those things. If you lived in prison, you probably never had any access to any of them. I don't even know if you get newspapers or if you read about it, a new computer, well, what is that? But if you get released into the new world, it can be very confusing.
Starting us off with number 10 are Catherine and Curtis Fairchild Jones. In Melbourne, 1999, at 13 and 12 years old, Catherine and Curtis became the youngest people ever charged as adults for first-degree murder. The two shot their father's girlfriend Sonia and had plans to murder their father as well and another male relative for sexually molesting them. As soon as they had shot her, they realized what a huge mistake they'd made and they ran to their neighbor's house and said it was an accident. Even after evidence of abuse was found, no one did anything. No one believed the two were being abused and they were sent to jail. During their trial, they never brought up the abuse. Nothing about what they had endured was even mentioned. I mean, the man who was abusing them was convicted of sexually assaulting his girlfriend's daughter years prior. Why was this not brought up by their defense during their trial? I have no idea. Then the justice system failed them and they pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and were sentenced to 18 years and probation for life. They were both released in 2015 at 29 and 30 years old. That's basically your whole prime part of life all spent in jail.
In our 9th spot, we have Chaylin Funes. 18-year-old Chaylin Funes was ruthless the night she killed a man named Eric Fisher. That night, she hit Fisher with her car, slamming him through a fence. Then she backed up, hit him again, and then dragged his body down the street. This was all witnessed by the man's family. During her sentencing, she broke down reading an apology note to the Fisher family. But the judge did not buy her apology. He even called her out, saying, and I quote, "The tears I'm seeing from the defendant are crocodile tears." Didn't matter how much she cried and choked on her words, she was still sentenced to life in prison. Moving on to number 8, we have Dylan Shoemaker. But before I go any further, you know the drill. Hit that like button, subscribe, and hit that bell notification button. Just do all that. It really helps us out. 17-year-old Dylan Shoemaker was arrested and convicted of murder and abuse of his girlfriend's child. He was asked to babysit the child, but when his girlfriend returned home, he had been killed. Apparently, the kid wouldn't stop crying, and so he turned to extreme measures. But in court, Dylan was the one that couldn't stop crying. He burst into tears while delivering his final statement. Now, apparently before he entered the courtroom, he told the guards that they should watch the performance that he was going to put on. So it could just be that him crying his eyes out was all just one big act to get out of his sentence. Didn't Didn't work though. Coming in at number 7, we have Jacob Morgan. In 2015, Jacob Morgan set fire to his house that led to the death of his younger brother. Now, Jacob argued that he didn't do it intentionally. The fire was an accident and he tried to save his brother, but before he knew it, the whole home was engulfed in flames. But Jacob loved playing with fire, and weeks prior he actually set his room on fire but was able to quickly put out the flames. In court, Jacob could not keep it together. While bawling his eyes out, Jacob can be seen praying. And then, when he gets his sentence, he freaks out even more.
I am going to find that there is probable cause to charge the individual with the down over for General Sessions Court for more charges.
Moving on to number 6, we have Antonio Barbeau. Antonio Barbeau was only 13 years old when him and his friend killed his great-grandmother. Apparently, the two wanted money for pizza and weed and thought to do so by killing the grandmother and stealing her money and jewelry. Let me repeat that again. They killed an elderly woman all for pizza and weed. That's ridiculous. Well, both were found guilty, obviously, and sentenced to life in prison with eligibility for parole in 36 years. During Antonio's hearing, he breaks down while reading his statement. His lawyer then had to finish it for him.
I took away someone's mother, their grandma, sister, friend, when I had no right to do so.
We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with Fernando Salgado. So in 2012, Fernando attacked one of his classmates with a weapon, and then he tried to insert another up the classmate's rectum. As a result, he was charged with assault with a deadly weapon and 1 count of attempted assault with a foreign object. After receiving his sentence, Fernando broke down. He can be heard begging to let go when he's seen fighting with the guards. He's resisting with all his might, trying not to be put in prison. In our 4th spot, we have Spencer Lewis. Spencer Lewis was involved in an armed robbery gone wrong. He attempted to rob 2 brothers of their weed, money, and video games, but Lewis ended up shooting and killing the 2 brothers. He said he got scared during the robbery and that's why he fired. On Spencer's hearing, he entered the court smirking, acting all cocky and confident, which later turned into tears.
The victim's family, I never went there with that intention of hurting them.
But after his little breakdown, he can be seen leaving the court, smirking once again to the camera. So was it all just an act? Maybe. Moving on to number 3, we have Keyshawn Mann. I think this teen has to be the youngest convict on the list. Keyshawn Mann was only 13 years old when he shot and killed his mother's boyfriend, Jermell Stokes. He claimed that the boyfriend was mistreating him. Back in 2012, Keyshawn grabbed his mother's handgun, snuck up behind Jermell, and shot him in the back of the head. But his defense argued that the shooting was accidental. After he received his sentence, the courtroom went crazy. Keyshawn's family members were yelling and screaming, saying that he's innocent. And then one man got tackled and then removed from the court. Coming in at number 2, we have the collapsing duo. In this video, you can see Erica Mae Butts and Shanita Latrice Cunningham both resisting being taken away after learning that they would spend the rest of their lives locked away. Now, Landon and I did react to this video in our courtroom freakout video, so go check that out. But now I did some research and found out what they were in for. So Erica and Shanita were convicted of killing a young girl back in 2009. Apparently they were looking after her, but instead were torturing her for 2 weeks straight. That just makes me sick to my stomach. Well, in this video you can see the two flop to the floor and refuse to get up after hearing their sentence. In fact, one of the girls had to be placed in a chair and rolled away. While this is all happening, one of the girls' mothers is just completely freaking out. It was just complete madness in that courtroom. And in our number 1 spot, we have Shondell Jackson. In 2009, 19-year-old Shondell Jackson was convicted of first-degree intentional homicide and robbery of a university student, Nathan Potter. During the attempted robbery of Potter, Jackson and his partner fatally shot him to death. During most of his trial, Jackson kept his cool. He showed no remorse for his actions, and at one point he even turned and smiled at the victim's family. But after being sentenced to life in prison, his demeanor quickly changed. became angry and started cursing at the judge. He stood up to leap at the judge, but officers were there to quickly take him down and then pepper spray him.
In at number 10, we have George Perrot, who was just 17 years old when he was arrested, and soon after he was convicted of rape and an assault that took place back in 1987. Well, George spent 30 years in prison after it was deemed that he was actually wrongly convicted due to bogus FBI evidence.
He was convicted mainly on an FBI agent's testimony about a microscopic hair found in connection with the rape. But a judge found that evidence to be flawed and released Perrot on personal recognizance Wednesday.
This is why the justice system is just so messed up. A lot of times police officers or FBI agents are convinced, they're so convinced that this is the guy that committed the crime. So what they do is they do anything they can to get a conviction, to put this guy behind prison and to do it fast. Well, we have witnessed in the past them giving false statements, tampering with evidence, and a lot of times we have witnessed FBI agents and police officers get it wrong. They convicted the wrong person.
Did you ever lose hope after all those years?
No, absolutely, of course. I've been in 30 years. A crime I didn't commit, of course I lost hope.
For people who may not have hope, what do you want them to know? He's got to pull out.
Don't give up. Don't give up, that's for sure. Don't give up.
Timothy Masters comes into this list at number 9. On February 11th, 1987, the body of Peggy Hetrick was found in a field and she had been stabbed in the back and sexually mutilated. 15-year-old Timothy Masters lived in a trailer that was only 100 feet away from her body. The police questioned him and searched his room and found several thousand pages of violent journal entries and drawings in his closet and a collection of knives. Even though there's no physical evidence linked him to the crime, he was charged and convicted of the murder and he was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Well, 12 years later, his sentence was later removed when DNA evidence proved his innocence. Timothy Masters was given $5.9 million in order to settle the wrongful conviction lawsuit. The wrongfully convicted Marvin Anderson comes into this list at number 8. Marvin Anderson was only 18 years old when he was convicted of robbery, sodomy, abduction, and rape. An all-white jury convicted him on all the counts and he was sentenced away to 210 years in prison. I mean, is this real life right now? However, in 1988, another man came forward and admitted that he was the one that actually committed the crime. He fully confessed under oath. He did this in an open court, but the judge who presided over the original trial refused to drop the charge on Marvin Anderson. Marvin spent a total of 15 years in prison, but it took another 4 years to become fully exonerated. And now at number 7, we have Dennis Brown. He was convicted of rape back in 1984 when he was only 17 years old, and this is after the victim picked him out of a lineup. You know when they stand there and you're like, he's the man, number 3? Dennis Brown claimed that the police had threatened him at knife point, forcing him to confess to the charges. The jury found him guilty, and when he was charged with aggravated rape, burglary, and aggravated crimes against nature, which gave him a sentence of life imprisonment. Dennis Brown contacted the Innocence Project and DNA tests concluded that he was not the rapist. So in 2004, after serving 19 years in prison for a crime he never committed, he was finally released. The Dixmoor 5 comes into this list at number 6. The Dixmoor 5 are 5 African American men who were falsely convicted of rape and murder of a 14-year-old KATEHIS Matthews. At the time of the arrest, the 5 men were between the ages of 14 and 16 years old. During the intense and long interviews, 3 of them gave false confessions because they were coerced and physically abused and threatened during the interrogation. Each of them received at least 80 years in prison, but in 2011, DNA tests concluded that the semen on the victim belonged to another man. All of the charges were dropped after they spent 20 years in prison and they finally became free men in 2011. They reached a wrongful conviction settlement of $40 million, which is actually the largest settlement in Illinois' history. Moving on to Thomas Hainesworth, and he makes it onto this list at number 5. He was arrested at the age of 18 years old after a woman identified him as the attacker. He was convicted of 4 violent rapes and sentenced to a total of 84 years in prison. Thomas Hainesworth maintained his innocence throughout his time spent in prison, and based on new DNA evidence, the real perpetrator was believed to have been his neighbor and closely resembles him. After the DNA testing, he was exonerated and was released from prison in March of 2011 after spending 27 years in prison behind bars. So for this wrongful conviction, he was given a lump sum of $1 million. I bet you the guy was taxed on it and only took home like just over half. He had 2 types of pensions, and he was also given a tuition at a community college. Christopher Abernathy takes the number 4 spot. On October 5th, 1984, the body of a 15-year-old girl was found behind a shopping mall. She had been raped and stabbed to death. More than a year after the crime, police brought in 18-year-old Christopher Abernathy for questioning. After 40 hours of interrogation, he had signed a confession which stated that he attempted to rape her and accidentally stabbed her with a pocket knife. Christopher was a high school dropout, and he had a learning disability as well. So the police used this and coerced him into making a false confession. He was eventually sentenced to life in prison because he was 17 years old at the time of the murder. The jury initially wanted him to get the death penalty. After the Innocence Project picked up his case, new DNA evidence exonerated him of all charges, and he was released after spending 28 years behind bars as an innocent person. The West Memphis 3 ironically make it into number 3 spot. This was a murder case that shocked the world. 3 little boys were found tied up. They were tied up with their own shoelaces, sexually mutilated, beaten, and left for dead. The local authorities arrested 18-year-old Damian Eccles, 16-year-old Jason Baldwin, and 17-year-old Jesse Miss Kelly because they were known around town for wearing black and listening to heavy metal. All 3 of these teenagers were convicted of the murders and were sentenced away to serve life in prison, except for Damian Eccles, who was sentenced to death. This is a highly controversial case because all of the evidence was circumstantial, so a lot of people believe that they are actually innocent. The Scottsboro Boys comes into this list at number 2. They are 9 African American teenagers who are accused of raping 2 white women on a train back in 1931. These were 9 unemployed young men who were illegally riding the train. They were held in Alabama on minor charges, and they convinced these 2 women into saying that these young boys had raped them. Within 2 weeks of this false accusation, the Scottsboro Boys were convicted, and 8 of them were sentenced to death. And the youngest boy, who was 13 years old, was sentenced to life imprisonment. One of the women who have claimed to be a rape victim came forth and admitted that she was coerced and manipulated into accusing these boys of raping her when they never even touched her. And finally, in the number 1 spot, we have George Stinney. On March 1944, 2 young girls had been found brutally murdered and beaten over the head and dumped into a ditch. George Stinney was a 14-year-old African American who was convinced of the murder as a result of racially biased and discriminatory jury. He was convinced in less than 10 minutes by an all-white jury, and he was sentenced to death. He was denied an appeal, and he was executed by the electric chair. A group of lawyers and activists investigated this case, and in 2014 he was exonerated of all the charges nearly 70 years later. Starting us off on this list, in at number 10 we have a teenager, ERIN Schmidt, who was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for murdering his 14-year-old neighbor, Elena Callahan. If for some reason Schmidt outlived his sentence, he will have an additional 5 years on his sentence. So that 5-year sentence will run consecutively after any other sentencing he might receive in the future for a possession charge. He will also have another 10 years of his sentence for theft, and again that's going to start after all of his other sentencing has been completed. After sentencing, it was actually appealed to the Georgia Supreme Court due to what in people's opinions were saying the sentence was cruel and an unusual punishment. But the judge rejected all the arguments in court and said he finds the evidence it was sufficient enough to find Schmidt guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of his crimes, and the punishment, it fit the crime.
Coming in at number 9, we have a big breakout. If you're gonna break out, you might as well bring some of your friends with you, right? Well, some teens in Nashville thought that this was the best idea. They had a plan to break out, and I think it worked better than they ever would have expected. Here's an opening from the news story that was covering the incident.
Good evening. Take a look at these photos. Tonight, the hunt continues for 7 teens who escaped from the Woodland Hills juvenile.
The news highlighted the 7 that were still on the loose, but 32 actually made a break at the same time. That's what you call teamwork. Basically what happened was all of these teens kicked out the windows to their rooms at the same time and then jumped out the windows and hightailed it into the woods. Now you might think it would have been confusion that caught all of these cops off guard, and that's why so many people were able to get away, but it was actually just incompetence on the side of the police. They didn't even notice that the teens had escaped until an hour after it had happened. Coming in at number 8, we have Miko West. If you break out of prison, the first thing you're going to want to do is lay low. Well, that's what they have you believe in the movies. that there's some secret hideout you can go to and there's a bunch of your friends there, maybe there's an Xbox and there's always really good food. But in reality, when you get out of prison, you have nowhere to go. You don't even have clothes to change into, and you're obviously in an orange jumpsuit. So unless you have everything planned out, most criminals who escape will turn back to crime because it's the only way they can get money and something to eat. This is what happened to Miko West. He was able to break out by swiping a key card and then opening the front door and just walking right out. That sounds like something that was pulled right out of a video game, but it was true. Then he got busted when he tried to steal a candy bar. The dude was just trying to get something to eat. Coming at number 7, we have the Nashville teens. A juvenile detention center in Nashville was holding 4 possibly dangerous teens who managed to escape in December of 2019. How they escaped is still unknown, but it's thought that they snuck past the guards and then jumped a fence and then were on the run. Now, why were these teens being held? I mean, the 4 of them were between the ages of 15 and 17, so how deadly could they be? I keep thinking about what I was doing at that age, and I really was just trying to spend more time playing video games and less time doing homework. That's as crazy as I got. Well, it turns out that these 4 might have been up to something a little more intense. 2 of them were wanted for armed robbery, and the other 2 were wanted for murder. Well, I don't think there's any homework in jail, so I guess that's a little bit of a bonus. Coming in at number 6, we have Joyride. A Louisiana detention center had 3 teens break out with an escape vehicle that was drawing a lot of attention, because there's a lot of ways in which you could slip out of a detention center. You could do the whole walk through the woods thing for hours and people chase you down with lights and dogs. That's a classic. There's also the Shawshank crawl through a mile of poop and then you come out on the other side and then you move to Mexico. Or my favorite, which is sit on each other's shoulders and wear a massive trench coat and a fake mustache, but that's a very advanced technique. But these teens wanted to escape in something that was a lot less inconspicuous. The 3 of them decided that they would jump into a cop car and drive into the city. Well, it didn't take long for the cops to pull them over and the 3 teens were thrown back in prison. It seems that these teens were going for the hiding in plain sight approach to sneaking away. Coming in at number 5, we have It Worked in the Movies. Let's move back over to Nashville, where one teen wanted to try another escape tactic. This goes to show that you can't trust anything you see in the movies, because when you try it in real life, it doesn't work out at all. Like when this teen tried to escape from a juvenile prison by walking through the ceiling. When you see something like that happening in the movies, it always seems like the sneakiest move of all time. When someone slides through the vents and it's all perfectly clean, and then when in reality it would be packed with bugs and it would be one of the loudest things of all time. Well, look at what happens when people try to recreate the movies in real life. As you can see from the clip, they could hear him walking around in the ceiling, and eventually he came smashing through the drywall. You know what? I'm gonna give this guy an A+ for trying and even getting into the ceiling in the first place. Even though his plan didn't come together, it's still very bold. Coming in at number 4, we have Bretan McAuliffe. This one is actually terrifying. Bretan McAuliffe was arrested for attempted murder. He was only 16 years old, so they put him into a juvenile correctional facility. He was meant to serve all of his time there, but while staying at the facility, they thought it would be a good idea to include him in a program that would help troubled youth find work while they were serving time. So he was given a job as a construction worker, and it seemed like things were going well until one day he just vanished. He literally just walked off the job site. A very simple escape plan, but an effective one. This is where the story gets even crazier. Bretan was on the run for over a month, and in this time he stole a gun and shot a woman 4 times. Thankfully, the woman lived. Coming in at number 3, we have Ty Harris, the getaway master. It doesn't matter how hard the police try to catch this kid, it seems they can't keep him behind bars. Ty Harris was originally in a standoff with police where they were chasing him down for robbery. He had this standoff, but then he slipped away. The police eventually caught him, and then he was locked up in a Nashville juvenile detention prison. While staying there, he realized the best way to not be in prison is to break out through one of the windows and escape on foot. This is when his skills skills at evading the police came into play again. Ty made it to a strip mall, and when the police showed up, he hid behind a truck and the cops didn't see him, and then they drove off while he was right under their noses. Ty then stole a truck from this strip mall parking lot where the cops were just looking for him and slipped away and was nowhere to be found. Holy moly, this kid is good at not getting caught. Coming in at number 2, we have party time. Sometimes you break out of prison not because you wanted to get free and run away from your punishment. No, you just wanted a little bit of a breather. You want to stretch your legs a little bit, maybe catch up with your friends and feel good for a little while before you have to go back. Well, apparently this happens more often than you would think. Juvenile detention centers all over America have had teens who break out after prisons are finished doing their rounds. They will sneak out and go party with their friends for a little while, usually have their friends meet them outside with some sort of substances that make them feel really good. Then before it's time to wake up in the morning, they will be back in their beds like nothing happened. Maybe prisons should be a little more fun and people wouldn't be trying to break out all the time. God, I'm so smart. And coming in at the number 1 spot, we have TJ Lane, one of the most terrifying teens to ever escape prison. TJ Lane was given a triple life sentence for coming to his high school with a handgun and killing 3 students in cold blood. He did this all while wearing a shirt which he wrote the word killer on the front. On top of this, in a way to mock his victims, he wore another shirt that said killer to his sentencing. While held in a state prison, he saw an open window and made a break for it. Thankfully, he wasn't on the loose for very long before he was captured. This could have turned out to be so much worse, but he was quickly taken back to prison, where he will most likely be for the rest of his life.